And welcome to another one of our now regular Friday sessions where we discuss essays and lectures by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, the foremost authority on the philosophy of Ayn Rand, objectivism. Today we'll be discussing The American School, Why Johnny Can't Think, a lecture he delivered at the famous Boston Ford Hall Forum in 1984, 2 years after Ayn Rand's death. And an essay in which he discusses the shocking decline in American educational standards that was then a major headline in the American news. It's important to recognize a couple of things about Dr. Peikoff's context here. He was his own PhD dissertation advisor at New York University was the famous philosopher Sidney Hook, who was himself one of the leading proteges of John Dewey, the most influential philosopher of education in American history. And so Dr. Peikoff has sort of some credibility here. And in order to prepare for this lecture, he actually visited several schools, some of the finest schools, in fact, progressive, non-progressive schools, some of them elite schools, some of them ordinary schools. But he went on sort of a fact-finding mission to discover the state of American schools. And this essay, this lecture, is reprinted in The Voice of Reason, Essays in Objectivist Thought, edited by Dr. Peikoff. This essay is basically his report on his findings.
Well, hello, James.
Hi, Ed. Joined again by the great Ed. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing, Ed?
Yeah, all good, all good. So we have by now studied a handful of these Peikoff lectures, and I am starting to appreciate the structure between the lectures, how they are all connected, but also within the lectures themselves. They're all structured in a very understandable way, in a sense that you can trace how Peikoff starts from the causes and then leads on to explain the particular effects of some issue. And in this lecture, he does take an issue of education and how progressive education is basically demising. Now, listening to this lecture, I could not recall the lecture that we have broke down 2 weeks ago, which is Why Picture is Not an Argument. Now, for those that have listened to us discuss that lecture, we did conclude that anti-conceptual mentality is the cause of that particular problem. Now, the same term, anti-conceptual mentality, also does feature in this lecture. So, and anti-conceptual mentality, let's just say, is an example of bad epistemology without using too many terms, just to keep it simple. But in this particular application, in this particular instance, bad epistemology is explaining why the education is suffering and why children are not able to learn in as efficient way as they could be learning. So to get us started, James, could you just say a few words about how the bad epistemology, what's at the base, what's the base cause of the issue that Peikoff is describing here?
Well, it is a philosophical thing, and just to set a little more historical context, in the late 1960s through the 1970s, all manner of government resources were being poured in to education in a way that they had never been poured in before. By the late 1970s, we had a whole federal Department of Education with billions now spent on education. But during the course of that same period, educational standards were declining. Illiterate graduates of public schools were on the rise, and I'm not exaggerating. There were shocking declines in the standardized test scores for verbal and mathematical skills from high school graduates, shocking stories about how American college sophomores could not pick the United States, their own country, off of a world map and things like that. Just really disturbing ignorance and poor quality of education despite the increased resources. So what could explain that? Dr. Peikoff went to good schools where there were good teachers and some of the finest private schools in America, and yet the standards there were among the worst. The only way you can really explain something like that is the methodology, is the using the fancy word epistemology, theory of knowledge, that goes into the education of the pedagogical techniques used by teachers. And of course, the story here is philosophy and the shocking subjectivism about concepts that has characterized contemporary philosophy since Immanuel Kant. For Kant, all of our broad abstraction, sense perception doesn't get us in contact with reality, but all of our highest abstractions are themselves just forms of our own consciousness. They're contributions of our mind, not features of the world. And here I'm talking about things like time, space, entity, even logic. Wouldn't that be nice if logic were the way we had to think? But these were all forms of our consciousness that we just impose on reality. Concepts said the 20th century nominalists were mere conveniences, human sort of arbitrary, collections of things. And this, of course, had the effect of destroying any conceptual approach to any topic of study. In effect, and he goes through several fields of study and how this, in fact, necessarily separates out any conceptual understanding and destroys any ability to understand the topic. The difference here is between perceptual knowledge, which requires no effort. It's an automatic function of the brain. Once we get it as a baby, we perceive, and we perceive automatically. I can't give you tips, I can't give you advice. There's no normative science on how to perceive. On the other hand, concepts require a specific method and a specific training. And human beings over the years have learned how to train the conceptual. I mean, at one time, we had no idea of formal logic. One of the great things about human beings is that we can attend to our own method of knowing. We can be self-conscious about how we know. And at the conceptual level, it has to be trained. Those are learned things, not just logic, but say all the way up to the modern scientific method. How to think properly, how to think objectively needs to be trained on the conceptual level. And this is the main difference. Percepts are a multiplicity of this complex world that we just open our eyes and see, whereas there has to be a certain structure and order to learning at the conceptual level, and that has to be taught in a certain way. Progressive education, unfortunately, and this is the wider thing that integrates this, progressive education is anti-conceptual. What it does is it attempts to treat conceptual matters in a perceptual way, as if automatic and revealed, and that there is no objective order at which we have conceptual order, which we can bring in effect to any topic, whether it's reading, grammar, history, science, you name it.
I'll start off with some of the examples that Peikoff draws, and some of them are actually quite amusing, as I found them.
Sadly amusing in some cases.
Yeah. So seal hunting, and then playing a drama play where people were playing Eskimos or something, as I remember it. Well,
it was about seal hunting. And it was to kids who had never experienced that in their lives. Exactly. And so rather than something practical for them, like it might be to the Inuits of Alaska, and the kids in the desert Southwest were being taught about seal hunting and so forth, as if that was a conceptual matter, as if that was a proper way of integrating the topic. Peikoff asked the masters of these schools, the principals and directors of these schools, why show me integration? And so they would give him topics like ecology or seal hunting or something that were sort of pseudo integrations. poor integrations, ways in which the student can't really put it together in a non-arbitrary way. And that actually trains the mind to not see the conceptual, to not see the common denominators or the important essential features of something. To see that requires training. And that sort of training is actually counterproductive to the training of the conceptual mind. It floods them with concretes that aren't integrated to, say, the topic at hand, history or science.
Whenever I listen to lectures by Peikoff, I try to come up with personal examples as well, because it helps me concretize the issue and make it dramatic for myself, so that I may recall it with better clarity when I have to. So listening to this, I thought of some examples where I too was kind of a victim of the same issue. So I studied finance in university, and in my economics lectures, I have always just tried to memorize things without reducing them to reality, or even giving some rudimentary reasons for why these concepts exist. So one particular is the fact that in the Keynesian theory, government spending is considered good by default. So the more government spends is, in effect, the more GDP there is, the more total welfare there is in the economy. And I would memorize such concepts without really reducing them, without really asking questions. Well, why is it good? What makes it?
And savings is just a leakage, don't you know? Saving and investment is just a leakage. My Keynesian professors would tell me, "Oh, we don't need savings." Everything's demand. You have to. That's exactly. Well, the great irony of progressive education is that it comes out saying that we're opposed to rote memorization, the old-fashioned classical method of a teacher standing up there lecturing with their authority. While the kids are poor kids are just sitting there taking notes, memorizing by rote whatever it is that the teacher is telling them about math or science or history. And, it's really stupid memorization. The irony is, of course, that concepts are what allows us to not rely so heavily on our memory. The way I, as a historian, for example, have an easy time remembering history is that I have it organized conceptually. To not have it organized, see, the whole point of concepts, according to Ayn Rand, is to give us this efficiency, this unit economy, this ability to deal with vast numbers of concretes with single entities, concepts. And this requires us, however, to see the essence of the concept. And it's that specific kind of training that is not part of progressive education. When you don't have, conceptual education requires a certain order. It is far easier for me to teach you history, for example, in a certain proper way, so that you can actually, or economics, as you're discussing there, finance, economics in a certain proper way, so that you can learn how to abstract and integrate on your own by pointing out the essential. And if you don't have someone who already has vast expertise in this, they can't ferret out what's essential. They can't ferret out what's important and what's going to help the student form concepts that will help their memory. So if you don't have a correct conceptual approach, you're actually dooming the child to have to memorize a whole list of concretes. And you're putting a greater strain on their memory, on the unit economy. That's why these students, after all of this education, come out unable to pick out their own country on a world map. It's just memorized for a minute and then it goes right out because of the limitations of consciousness, what objectivists call the Crow epistemology. They can't retain it.
And I do have to say that my memory is quite good. So what I would usually do before the exam is just memorize things that are essentially disconnected from anything real, and then write the exam, get a grade, and then happily forget about it
I did that all the time in my history courses. I'm given the 12 different causes for the American Civil War. the tariff, westward expansion, the railroad, politics in the South, politics in the North, all these various things that, that they say are the various causes, the 12, and you could be 24 if you're in graduate school, like Pico says, but if they throw out indiscriminately 12 different causes, and I can't even organize or discriminate between those causes, all I could do was memorize and throw back at them the causes they said were significant and why they thought they were significant without any attempt to integrate it on my part. I have since learned to become conceptual about history. The American Civil War was all about slavery. Now, there are those who want to say, leftist historians want to say it isn't. It's about the tariff or the railroad or northern economic interests, but they all boil down conceptually to the same thing. It was ultimately a battle about the institution of slavery. And if you can't reduce the matter conceptually in that fashion, how are you going to organize in your mind the role of the tariff or building railroads to the West or admitting new states, all the other issues that were supposed to be those 12 other causes that are supposed to be the cause of the Civil War? Of course, conceptually, it's much easier on the memory, but that can only be achieved with a teacher who knows the subject and knows how to organize the material and be able to reduce it to the appropriate number of concepts that are essential to teaching history, so that the student, whatever history they now start to study later in life, they'll be able to think about history in a conceptual way.
Boy, do I wish you were my history teacher, James, when I was a kid.
I was very fortunate that in high school I had a very non-progressive history teacher who taught conceptually. She lectured. She did not entertain just bold sessions with the students with the assumption that they know just as much as she did about history. She taught it in a chronological order, she taught it conceptually, and she lectured. She only asked questions to test our knowledge. She didn't ask questions to get our opinion as if it was as informed or as well thought through as her opinion was. She was teaching us how to think about history. And so for that, there's no conflict between content and method. The progressives always say, we don't want to teach content, we want to teach method. Well, that's a bizarre false alternative. How do you teach any method without some content? Once you give it, and besides, there is some content that's important to deliver to the student. So it's not a dichotomy. You can't even teach method without a certain content, and that content has to be organized in a methodical, preconceived way in order to elicit the concept and the conceptual thinking on the part of the student.
Yeah, and that's a very nice segue to my positive example from my experience. So in high school, during my physics classes and when we started learning about Newton's first and second laws and acceleration and velocity, at the very same time, I had my algebra classes whereby we were learning about first and second order derivatives, and later we had calculus. So whilst in physics we were doing experiments on, as an example, one experiment would be, let's have a sliding trolley down an incline with a stamper that would let you measure at what speed the trolley would travel, so that then you could take this tape, that would be your data about the trolley's velocity, and you could then derive acceleration from it. So remembering that, being able to apply things learned in the algebra class to this concrete experiments that we did in the physics class made me very, very happy. Why? Because I saw how the world was intelligible. I knew that what was learned in one field was sometimes applicable to other fields. And so knowledge may multiply, knowledge is useful, and you can study the nature of things. So
that is a powerful one. My dad is a scientist and mathematician. He connected in my mind before school ever did, and outside of school ever did. My dad connected in my head the relationship between Descartes, the discovery of analytic geometry, Newton, the discovery of calculus, and how that could integrate with physics, and how suddenly modern physics could be born out of an explanation of the physical world through mathematical formula. Uh, boy, boy, is that a powerful example of human the integration and the importance of teaching conceptualization and integration in human knowledge. The very thing lacking in modern American schools is that kind of integration.
Yeah. Notice how in this particular example, there is a perceptual part, the trolley going down the incline and you being able to perceive firsthand what its velocity is, but also studying a very abstract subject such as algebra and calculus and being able to apply that. I think that is extremely powerful.
Take the way reading methods. Dr. Peikoff talks about, for example, the look-say method, which is sheer memorization. What you're doing is you're demanding this huge ability of this small child still learning to read. Each word has to be in effect remembered to be associated with the concept. Whereas a conceptual way of learning to read is to learn the sounds phonetically. The sounds and the letters are in effect act as concepts, as universals that can now be applied to a structure of language. I know English is filled with all kinds of exceptions, makes it a difficult language to learn. But nonetheless, once you learn certain rules and their exceptions, you can conceptually come to read the language, and even words that you don't know, you can pronounce and say, this is what the word's pronunciation is. And reading then becomes a conceptual matter. So it even boils down to how you teach a kid to read in the first instance. And the anti-conceptual approach, look-say, is no wonder it was producing illiterates, as opposed to phonetics. No question about it. Phonics, excuse me. There's no question about it. You look at history again with the 12 causes or whatever. Grammar is another example that Dr. Peikoff uses. Dr. Peikoff has an outstanding course, by the way, on the principles of grammar that he taught as a philosopher. In his mind, it's a straightforward topic, but in his mind, the rules of grammar in any language have an objective basis. There's a reason for the parts of speech. There's a reason for the form that sentences take in a certain language. And understanding those reasons is the conceptual way of understanding grammar. And you have the National College of Teachers Association coming out saying, well, no linguistic forms are better than any other linguistic forms. Then why have teachers at all, as Peikoff observes? Why have teachers at all?
Yeah, so that actually leads me to my next question. I did want to get into what Peikoff then explains about the teachers' colleges, and I have absolutely no historical context about how that development came about. So if you could just say a few words about what are the teachers' colleges, how were they established, and what was their end effect on this whole dance?
It used to be thought that the most important quality in a teacher was expertise in their given field, or at least for the teachers of the very young, that they learn the basic subjects that they're teaching. The substance of the topic, mastery of the topic used to be considered the important qualification. Pedagogy in itself has certain rules, and there is a certain science to it, but it is very easily taught. It is very easily taught. Progressive education came along with John Dewey and his revolutionary ideas. As Dr. Peikoff points out, they really took hold in America in a way they did not, thank goodness, in other countries. To some extent, there was this new educational stuff that went through in some of the schools of the rest of the world. But in America, where we had so-called the best schools, we had the worst impact from philosophers like John Dewey. And he proposed a whole new pedagogical method, one that emphasized activities on the part of the student as opposed to the teacher authority, one that emphasized creativity. Now, how is a kid to be creative before he knows anything? How is a kid? What is the value of a kid being creative about topics like science or history until they actually know something about it? But no, we don't want to suppress the kid. Their knowledge is no inferior to the teachers. So it de-emphasized the role of the teacher. It de-emphasized rote learning, but ended up with much more required rote learning, because pedagogy itself and socialization, excuse me, I have to add that, socialization became all important as opposed to the topic itself. When these new ideas, progressive education ideas came along, a whole new idea in how to teach, the science of pedagogy, became more important, you see. If we're teaching method, not content, then what's more important, learning the content or learning pedagogy, the skills of teaching and how to socialize with your kids? So one of the places that Leonard Peikoff visited was one of the most important teachers colleges in America, Columbia University's College for Teachers. It pumped out a great percentage of teachers, especially in the New York area. And sure, there were political ideas that were bad there too, Marxism and so forth. But the worst thing was the epistemology they were being taught. But teachers' colleges are now the primary requirement for someone to become a public school teacher in this country. It is not a function of being an expert in this. And rather than learning the topic, they're learning how to teach and teach progressively. And by the 1970s, most teachers were the focus was now on learning progressive pedagogy rather than learning the topic that they were to teach. A dramatic step backwards, especially given the rules of pedagogy they were being taught.
Yeah, I really do like that you did mention that a teacher is supposed to be an authority on a subject to a student. So I'll try to articulate why I think that is the case. So it is important to keep the context in mind. And what is the context? Let's enter a classroom and you have 12-year-old kids there, perhaps, a teacher who in an ideal world would have acquired and internalized the necessary knowledge, and would also have the right techniques and knowledge about the most efficient way of presentation of this knowledge. Now, for this very reason, I think it is important now to say the added value that teacher adds is what I've just explained. So that would answer the question of why not just send out a child with a book in his hand and let him just independently study this stuff. Well, the thing is that you could do that. You could do that, but what results you will get is the question. I think it will be hit and miss. An expert teacher will be able to achieve a better efficiency on the time spent and knowledge acquired proportion than a child doing it independently. Would you agree with that, James?
Oh, yes. And for example, you were bringing up physics. If you are familiar, for example, with Newton, with Newton's Principia, you understand that there's a certain way to get to an understanding of that. It cannot be achieved randomly, unless you happen to have an Isaac Newton in the class who can reconstruct exactly Isaac Newton's breathtaking integration. Unless you have a student there who actually has the context and is a genius like Isaac Newton, it's going to be a total waste of time to elicit from the student, for example, their creative ideas on physics. They're never going to come up with Newton's Principia on their own, unless, lightning strikes and you get Isaac Newton. So, no. I have to give a personal example here. I was bored stiff usually in school, apart from the good history teacher I had and a couple of other good ones. I was bored stiff, and so I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading of stuff that, my father or my grandmother taught, well-educated people told me was important literature. Way over my head. Way over my head. I get to university, and I'm already sort of familiar with that with some of that material, but I had no clue. I needed expert guidance. I couldn't even understand three-quarters of it. I could barely understand even the percentage that I did understand. I needed expert guidance. Much more effective was selective readings in those books rather than reading the whole book. It really was. Because then they could focus on the essential, bring out that's what makes this thinker different from every other thinker. That's the fundamental here that explains the rest of his or her thought. That is what I needed. I needed an expert to guide me through that. So even the brightest, most motivated student, I wasn't the brightest, but I was a bright, motivated student, can't do it on their own and require expertise, the expertise of a teacher to help them conceptualize it properly. That's the key.
Yeah, learning is a very, I want to say, complex process until you actually start breaking things down to the percepts, and that has always been my experience when I can produce words to what they represent in reality. The confidence in my knowledge increases, and I'm able to operate that knowledge much more
And notice,
effectively.
that's exactly what Peikoff notices here. The kids who come out of these schools lack any confidence whatever. They not only having a shocking degree of ignorance, they not only haven't had their conceptual faculty trained, they are bored stiff in these classes, restless, anxious, not paying attention. Well, if my opinion's just as good as the teacher's in some history discussion, then, so what we're actually doing, and of course, because it's all rote memory, they forget it all, right? So the correct method of pedagogy requires an authority from the teacher, requires this being a sort of a laid down order, because there's a sort of deliberate and calculated, pre-designed order which can elicit the conceptual discovery on their own. But you're absolutely right. The attitude of the students is they come out bored, ignorant. The entire, as I say, the whole irony here of, say, memorization, despising memorization, you end up being concrete bound and have to memorize. The whole thing is we want kids to be active and participate and be creative, and they are actually bored out of their heads. Yeah, and that confirms my experience in public school too.
And notice what premise such students internalize as they come out of the school. Such premises, I think, would be the universe is unintelligible. I have no method of acquiring knowledge. I have no method of verifying knowledge. The list of negative premises really goes on. And here I'd like to make a reference to another discussion of ours, to certainty and happiness.
Yeah.
So as students come out of the school with such premises, with a messed up rational faculty, what tools at their disposal do they have to achieve happiness in this world? I say little, if any. I think that people who oppose such a system and who are in some way little school outlaws or outcasts are actually standing a better chance than people who follow all the rules and follow the rules very methodically in an outside world. And I was actually at some points in my school career, I was such a kid. I sometimes, when I would not understand the purpose of something, I would just not really follow the rules and sometimes break them. But James, what do you think about it? As students come out of the school, what can they expect with this sort of rational faculty that they have acquired?
I look around me today and I see the results. I see the grim results. I see the lack of confidence that can never achieve certainty. And it's not that we don't know things, we can't know things. It's not that, if I figured this out, I could figure it out. No, you can't figure it out. So they've not only deprived them of the tools, they've deprived them of the idea that the tools would even be worthwhile or work. You're absolutely right. So they are bereft, in effect, of the achievements of the human mind about learning itself, from Aristotle to the scientific method to hopefully one day Ayn Rand's theory of concepts. But they're left without the tools that humans have discovered about objectivity and about the correct method of knowing. And it's only that that can give them the confidence of their knowledge. Human knowledge is possible. We land on the moon on a dime every time. And without knowing the glory of the potential of human creative intellect and its possibilities, they are having, in effect, the entire psychology of that confidence pulled from under them. And you know, being an outsider, the other really good point you made, it is those misfits, those outsiders. This reminds me of an essay Ayn Rand wrote in 1970, The Comprachicos. Her analysis, which we discussed a few weeks ago in the Ayn Rand essay that we do on Tuesdays, Ayn Rand's analysis was a very grim analysis of progressive education, which was really coming down on American schools at that time. And one of the things she pointed out is the outsiders like you were the ones who stood the best chance of avoiding the damage of progressive education. You know, really, Ayn Rand, her essay, The Comprachicos, in 1970 was prophetic. And in 1984, when Dr. Peikoff is giving this lecture, he's in effect pointing out what without naming her and naming that essay, he's pointing out what a prophet Ayn Rand was of the grim reality that was to come. Ayn Rand probably could not have imagined the actual effect being, well, she did predict a grim effect, but she couldn't have predicted how bad and how quickly American schools fell apart under the weight of that. And Dr. Peikoff is here detailing and demonstrating what a prophet Ayn Rand was on those scores. You're absolutely right. If you're in a bad school like that, the best hope you have is ignoring as much of it as possible, tuning it out.
Another instance, positive instance of education is the Sunday study sessions that we have here on ARC UK. And we do reduce conceptual knowledge to perceptual data in order to fully grasp it. So if you are interested in jumping into further detail on the topics that we discuss here, please become a member of ARC UK and join our Sunday study sessions. Frankly, these are all the questions that I wanted to raise and the issues that I wanted to raise. Do you have any other remarks that you wanted to focus on, James?
Yes. You know, there's one thing I would add. Not only does Dr. Peikoff follow up on Ayn Rand's devastating prediction of what progressive education would do to America with what it had been doing to America in the years between the Comprachicos, say, and Leonard Peikoff's lecture here on why Johnny can't think, it was barely on America's radar screen when Ayn Rand was writing. By the time Leonard Peikoff wrote in 1984, the shocking decline in educational standards was all over the news, was front and center on the radar screen of the American mind. Books like the books that Dr. Peikoff refers to in this lecture, books like his title comes from, Why Johnny Can't Read and Why Johnny Still Can't Read, were very popular books at that time. And Americans were acutely aware of it by 1984 in a way they weren't when Ayn Rand was first bringing the world's attention to this. Since 1984, Dr. Peikoff has actually done an entire course, which has been reduced to book form, in fact, on the philosophy of education, in which Dr. Peikoff presents a positive pedagogical approach, a positive theory of education, and how teachers should approach their topic. I mean, and we're talking, kindergarten through high school, primary and secondary education, pre-university education. And I highly recommend that course and book to anyone interested in the topic of education. Leonard Peikoff followed that up by providing us with a positive theory of that. And finally, what I would say is that in the years since all of that has taken place, unfortunately, education standards have further declined in my country. For example, on standardized tests, the decline in scores was so dramatic that in the 1990s, they simply recalculated The government recalculated the way they would even measure ACT people, the standardized testing people from Princeton, recalculated the way they would even score standardized tests. They were becoming shockingly so low. And even since then, the standards have declined into the 21st century. So unfortunately, for many, many, if not the vast majority of American public school students, standards have in no way improved. They've only gotten worse. And the culprit is, as Dr. Peikoff says, not a question of resources, not a question even of politics. Although it would be great to replace starve out the public schools and replace them with private schools, because a free market competitive world would be better, I think, for educational standards. But the real culprit here isn't economics, isn't money, isn't even politics. It's epistemology. The philosophy, that subject of philosophy that discusses how humans know and their confidence in that knowledge. And it's that topic which has corrupted education in my country more than anything else.
Yeah, and it is interesting how once again Peikoff draws this line towards epistemology, bad epistemology in this case being the cause of this particular problem, and it is in that it is a very good lecture, because once again Peikoff does start with a very complex problem, but he reduces it to one particular unit that causes it, and I think that's why Dr. Peikoff is a brilliant lecturer.
Talk about giving us an example. He's talking about anti-conceptual teaching, and he gives us, as always, a brilliant example of conceptual teaching in the very process of telling us about this. That's Dr. Peikoff all over, embodying the very epistemological and even moral virtues that he lectures about in the very lecture that he's giving about it. Yeah, so the genius of Dr. Peikoff. Yes, and I just want to echo what you say. We, on Sundays, we do workshops on Dr. Peikoff's courses, and Dr. Peikoff has made it a special mission of his for over 20 years to make sure that objectivists weren't disconnecting their concepts from the facts of reality, and that we were taking the highest, were able to take the highest philosophical abstractions and be able to reduce them to the facts of reality to which they refer. So please join us on Sundays if you can, but that requires becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK, for which there are many, many benefits. Just Don Watkins' Communication Bootcamp alone is worth the minimum of £10 a month that it takes to join. So please consider joining and becoming a full subscriber to ARC UK.
Yeah, on that, I'd like to encourage people to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like this video if they found it informative and useful. And thank you very much, James, for being my interlocutor. And yeah, have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Ed. Yes. Take care.